Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Forest, Fire, and People webinar series brought to you by Colorado State University's Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Institute for Science and Policy. I am Kristen Eulenbrock. I am your co-host for this series and the director of the Institute for Science and Policy. It's my great pleasure to be joining you this night. I see people joining us from all over the state of Colorado, as well as California and Nebraska and beyond our borders. Before we get started tonight, I do want to acknowledge with respect that I and our guest reside on the traditional lands of 48 Native American tribes who now live throughout the American Southwest, the Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountain region, including the Southern Ute, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Shoshone tribes. Tonight's episode is number 2 in this series, and we're going to be focusing on the historic fires of 2020 in Colorado. What made 2020 so historic was absolutely the sheer size of all of these fires we had. Collectively, over 600,000 acres burned in Colorado last year, including 3 of the largest wildfires in Colorado's history. Lives and homes were lost, and our hearts go out to anyone who was directly impacted by last year's fires. As we'll be hearing about today, the impacts are not only upstream where the fires took place, but also downstream. Wildfires do impact all of us. We do have a top-notch lineup of guest speakers tonight who are going to share a lot of great insights about what happened in 2020. It's provide a little bit of view of what maybe to expect in upcoming future fire seasons, including this year. But let me go ahead and bring my co-host and partner into this conversation, John Sanderson, who's the director of the Center for Collaborative Conservation. Good evening, John. How are you tonight?
Hey, Kristen, doing well, thank you.
Great to have you. John, why don't you go ahead and continue on introducing our guests and providing a little more context for tonight's episode.
All right, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you who have chosen to spend an hour of your evening with us. In today's episode, we will build on the foundation we created last week, with tonight's guests helping us understand last year's fires. Much of our conversation today will focus on the Cameron Peak Fire, which was the big one just west of Fort Collins. At nearly 209,000 acres, that's more than 325,000 square miles, Cameron Peak is the largest fire on record in Colorado. But although we will be focusing a lot of attention on this fire, the insights from this fire apply broadly across the West. Next Monday, on April 5th, we'll discuss the human dimensions of fire, including the so-called wildland-urban interface, which is sometimes referred to as the WUI, and other aspects of living with fire next week. And then on April 12th, in 2 weeks, we'll be talking with 3 additional experts on the future of Western wildfires. Before introducing this evening's guest, Kristen and I want to acknowledge and thank the Gates Family Foundation for their financial support of this series. And we also want to thank our partners at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, the Colorado State Forest Service, and the Climate Adaptation Partnership. All these organizations helped us put this together, including focusing the content and recruiting guests and suggesting guests and so forth. And speaking of guests, our guests tonight are Russ Schumacher, Monte Williams, and Jen Kovecses. Russ serves as the Colorado State Climatologist, and he's the director of the Colorado Climate Center, in addition to his responsibilities as faculty here at Colorado State University, where he teaches and does research. Russ's research interests include weather analysis and forecasting, extreme events, and societal impacts of weather and climate. Russ received the Clarence Leroy Meisinger Early Career Research Award from the American Meteorological Society just in the last few months. So congratulations, Russ, and welcome.
Thanks so much, John. Glad to be here.
Our next guest is Monte Williams. Monte is the forest supervisor for the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forests and the Pawnee National Grassland, where he works for the U.S. Forest Service. Prior to this role, Monty worked with Congress on issues critical to the Forest Service mission. Monty brings a breadth of experience and passion for multi-use land management, having worked on a variety of national forests across the U.S. Thanks for joining us, Monty.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invite tonight. Looking forward to it.
And Jen has lived in Colorado for the last decade, and now she currently serves as the Executive Director of the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. Jen has led a career focused on aquatic ecosystems and has worked on a variety of watershed conservation projects across North America. She has tremendous expertise in managing post-fire restoration projects, which you will hear in the next 50 minutes or so. Jen, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for the invite, John. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, welcome all three of you. We're going to start this evening with each of our guests taking about 5 minutes to share a few key perspectives on the fires of 2020. Russ, let's start with you to share some key points about weather and climate.
Great. So yeah, I'll try to set the stage a bit for getting into the into what happened in more detail with the fire that Monty and Jen will share, but to try and set the stage a little bit for what we saw in terms of weather and climate last summer that led things to the situation that we ended up in. And I'll show a few graphs here and that hopefully will drive home some of that point as to what we saw and kind of where it stands historically. And so I'll start off here. I guess I can first direct you on the right to the map in the lower right. The star there is the location of this weather station at Grand Lake, just outside Rocky Mountain National Park. That was ended up right within the East Troublesome fire, which is shaded there in the red, and then the Cameron Peak fire just to the north. And just for orientation, you can see Fort Collins and Denver there on the map as well. And so what we see, we like looking at these quadrant charts, and because they give us a lot of information in a single graph. So on the x-axis on the bottom is precipitation, and then on the y-axis is temperature. And so the way we've plotted it here, basically, if you're up in the upper left, it's warm and dry, which is not where you want to be with respect to drought. If you're in the upper right, it's warm and wet. Lower right is cool and wet. Lower left is cool and dry. And so this is for one weather station at Grand Lake, which was again right where the East Troublesome fire occurred in October. And this covers the period from July 1st through October 21st, which is when the fire swept through there. And so all the various years from that weather station are plotted on here. And we see 2020, I've tried to highlight with the star there way up in the upper left. And so at this location, it was by far the driest over this particular period in the late summer and fall. And what's interesting, if we look in these higher elevation stations in Colorado, what we often see is a pretty narrow range of precipitation. So if you kind of look at the graph there, pretty much every year sits somewhere between 4 and 10 inches of rain over this period, with an average of about 7. And so not very frequent big variations. These look different if you look out like on the Eastern Plains, where you have some years that are just extremely wet and some years that are extremely dry. It's generally a narrower range up in the mountains. But in any case, what we see from 2020 is way up in the warm and dry quadrant. And so about a 6-inch deficit in rainfall from July 1st up until when the fire came through there, which is, a couple inches drier than the previous driest year, which was just the year before in 2019. So we can go to the next slide. And this now zooms out to all of Western Colorado and focuses here just on the month of August, which was when the most extreme conditions happened and kind of set the stage for what we saw with the wildfire season. So again, this is averaged over all of Western Colorado, and you see 2020 way up in the upper left, far beyond both. It was the hottest August on record for Western Colorado by about 2 degrees warmer than any previous August, and also the driest August on record for that part of the state. So again, August is the time in Western Colorado when we expect the North American monsoon to bring in, at least somewhat frequent rain and cloudiness and more humidity that all kind of work to keep the temperature down. But we didn't see any of that in 2020, and things heated up and dried out very quickly. So you can go to the next slide. And we'll kind of now look at things from the longer term perspective here, sort of where we are. And this graph is now Colorado statewide, and it's one metric of drought. There are a lot of different ways you can look at drought data, but this is one that we use a lot. It's called the Standardized Precipitation Index. And essentially it's just a measure of how unusually wet or dry or not it is in terms of precipitation. And here we're using 48-month time period. So this is like long-term, multiple year kind of drought situations. And so if we go back to when we have reliable data across the state back to the late 1800s, you can see some of so here the brown colors, less than 0, are the dry periods, and the green are the wet. But in any case, we can see some of the historic droughts over the last century plus in the region. The drought just after the turn of the 20th century, and then the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and then the 1950s, and the drought of the late 1970s, especially in the mountains. And then kind of a wet period through the 80s and 90s, and then our 3 more recent droughts since 2000, the one in 2002 into 2003, and then 2012, and then at the far right, the one that we're currently in. And so if we look at it from this perspective, the having 3 droughts within 20 years is not, it's somewhat more frequent than we see historically from this precipitation perspective, but not that different from what we saw maybe in the 50s and 60s. And kind of the lack of precipitation is certainly notable, but kind of ranks up there, not more extreme than the other ones. But what we're going to look at now is what happens when we also account for the effects of rising temperature. And a warmer atmosphere, all else being equal, a warmer atmosphere, especially in the summer, is thirstier. It's more efficient at taking water out of the soil, the vegetation, the forests, et cetera. And so if you go to the next slide, we see what this same graph looks like when we account for the temperature in this way in now what's known as SPEI, the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index. So it tries to account for the evaporation part, or the evapotranspiration part, that thirst of the atmosphere. And so now it's a pretty different picture over the last 20 years, where we see that it's essentially one long dry period with, with 3 kind of extremely dry periods in there. And so now, you see that 2002 period being kind of the most extreme, and that was, of course, a huge fire year as well. And then 2012, and then the ongoing drought, but really with no wet periods interspersed there. So when we were looking at just precipitation, it wasn't that unusual historically, but this is what we're kind of looking at as the climate warms, is we get into what's been termed by others as hot drought, where the precipitation deficits aren't historic. They're, it's dry, but not historically so. But when you add in the effects of the temperature, everything is drying out here in the West in that manner. So I think I will stop there and turn it over to our next presenter.
Great. Hi, Monte Williams. It's interesting with what Russ was talking about. When I was first starting out, and that district, normally we didn't see snow come off around the ranger station until somewhere in late April or early May. And then one year we had a fire that started in early March, and nobody could remember a fire actually burning in early March, more or less, with the fire behavior. And we thought that was an anomaly in the 90s. And over time, since that time, it's no longer an anomaly. And of course, in that area in Idaho that I started, we're seeing a lot more fires. But let me hop in. I thought that was really fascinating, and surely definitely supports kind of some of the things that I'm going to chat about. I've spent about half of my career as a professional hydrologist with the Forest Service. And during that time, a lot of my efforts went to evaluating the impacts of wildfire and dealing with floods and erosion that happened afterwards. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what conditions made the time ripe for the fires we saw last year. I'll focus on Cameron Peak Fire, which became the largest wildfire in Colorado's history. We all knew that this fire was going to happen someday up there. I'll show you some of the work we completed in years past that was designed to stop a large fire like Cameron Peak, and you'll also see what happened when it ran into it. So we've got the first slide up here, and what you see, these are the last year's large wildfires, and I actually say 4 of the 5 largest wildfires in Colorado history, because if you look at the top, the Mullen Fire, which was primarily in Wyoming, actually slopped down and was in the state of Colorado in a small amount. And 3 of the 5 largest fires in Colorado history burned on my forest at some point last year. So quite a bit of area when you think about the state of Colorado as a whole. Can you go to the next slide, please? I'm going to focus on the area that's shown by the box, and although it's probably hard to read the names, but that's the upper Front Range of Colorado. And so this area is the fire shed for the Cameron Peak Fire. And it's huge. It goes from Wyoming all the way down to Estes Park, and it goes from the Continental Divide all the way to Fort Collins. I think the point is of this, and I think this really makes this point well, is that when we're starting to talk about what do we do with fires like this, is there anything that we can do about them? You're talking a huge area. That is a huge area. Can I go to the next slide, please? Back one, there we go, perfect. Should be the trees, there we go. So all the trees, all the brush, even the needles you'll walk on the forest floor are all fuel for wildfires. And you've seen, many of you have seen photos like this before. This is off my national forest, but you look at 1896 and you don't see a whole bunch of trees out there. You see some, but not anything like the photo taking almost in the same spot and at the same direction as the photo in the right-hand side. You add the weather conditions that we saw this year that Russ described, and all of a sudden you now have the recipe for disaster, because on the left-hand side, that's a landscape that can handle fire. And even if fire hits it, it's not running and gunning like what you see on the right-hand side. That's continuous. There are tons of fuels that you see standing, but also tons of fuels on the ground. And I would say that as you look at Cameron Peak, particularly where it started, lodgepole pine were thick in there. And starting about the time this photo was taken, we started getting a bug epidemic that killed a large number of the trees in there. So we had a lot of standing dead that was ready to be burned. So next slide, please. Okay, this perspective, we zoomed into kind of the Cameron Peak area, and actually the movie that I'll show here in a second is of the same area. But I wanted to point something out. Even in this fire shed, we'd already had some fires, and that's the High Park fire that's really big up there. Bobcats is the next biggest one that's a little further south. Next slide, please. And work was started about 15 years ago, recognizing that, hey, there's going to be fires, and what could we do about them? And I, at that time, really didn't have a lot of thoughts about how it was all going to work and such. But they started working on prescribed fires and other types of thinning and things to give us a shot at stopping the fire. But about 5 years ago, a group of partners formed the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. And it's a grassroots organization that's stepping up efforts to make a difference with wildfire. That green stripe was our strategy, and we need to hold on the video. Yeah, green stripe is our strategy, and what we're doing is constructing a 1 to 3 mile wide area from the Wyoming border all the way down south of the park, where tree density is reduced and where prescribed fire has been used to consume other fuels. It kind of makes it look what that left-hand side of the photo did just here a few minutes ago. Wildfires usually burn west to east here. And so by stopping the fire at the stripe, we wanted to minimize the ability to continue to grow, the fire to continue to grow. We wanted to reduce the impact of the communities that are directly east of here. And we wanted to avoid damage to more wildlife habitat, more drinking water, etc. This wasn't the final strategy. It just is what we could do and get started with, and then we would go from there. So the next slice is actually already up, and there we go. Hold off on the video. The turquoise blobs are the work that we'd actually got done in that stripe, and so those are areas that have been thinned and burned. And then we also, as you noticed, took advantage of the High Park fire as part of our strategy. So what we'll see in the movie here in just a second is the video of the Cameron Peak fire as it burned last year. The little bright red dots at the left-hand side is the beginnings of that prescribed fire. And so it made 2 runs at the strategic work that we did, and then a 3rd run. And those 2 runs, you'll see what happens. The work that we did stopped it. But where we hadn't done work, that's where it blew out. It doubled in size. And most of the homes that burned were in that last run. So if you could start the video. Oh, go back one. That's the flood. There we go. Start that one. Thank you. I'm so complicated. So here's the fire, and what you'll notice up in the right-hand corner is the dates, and you're not seeing much growth, and this is very typical. It's still sunny, it's still hot, but the wind and the heat and the direction of the topography and all that stuff's not lining up. But we come up fairly soon to the Labor Day run, and all that aligns, and you'll see the fire more than double. Folks thought the snowstorm stopped it. It actually hit the fire areas up here, and there it goes, about 2 hours before the snow hit, and it was effectively stopped before the snow hit. Here starts the second run. It's actually burning up in a canyon there, and it's going to sit here for a little bit and then make a run towards Red Feather Lakes. And then the same thing, a series of prescribed burns and other work up there. We caught that fire again in the same spot. And so this fire sat on the landscape for a long time, not doing much. But then as we got into mid-October, we had another run, and what you're going to see it do is pop out on the bottom. We had a project planned in there, but we had not got started on it yet. We were just finishing the analysis, and we'd hoped that project would stop this run right here. And you'll notice it actually runs into that bobcat fire and kind of stops. And of course, the firefighters use that. So it's a real interesting video, I think, because what you're seeing both is the movement of a large fire across the landscape. And a lot of this landscape looks like a whole bunch of the West. But where we worked strategically and put treatments in place that made sense and were designed to do something, they worked. And where we didn't, it pooched out and hopped out on this other side. So what made that possible was this Fireshed Collaborative, and Jen Kovecses, who's getting on, I always make her blush because she is the ramrod of our group, our collaborative, and really works with the community. This is a grassroots effort where we work with the community to do things that make sense and work together, both on Forest Service, on private lands, on state, on whatever's there that we need to develop that strategy. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jen. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Those were both great foundations for what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully for a really good conversation with the audience. So what I'd like to focus on right now for the first couple of minutes is really just talking about why do we worry about these wildfires? What are those impacts that we are concerned about? And what does it look like for our communities moving forward to deal with those impacts? So, you know, when wildfires like this happen, the attention out of the gate is always on when the fire is active, when the flames are going, when communities are evacuating. There's a lot of attention on those dramatic moments. But from the perspective of a watershed, and you can start that video now, from the perspective of a watershed, it's really when the flames go out that the problems really start to happen. So why is that? We've already heard a little bit today from Monty that wildfires are a natural part of our ecosystems in the Rocky Mountain West. We have forests that are called fire-adapted forests and ecosystems. So why do we have these big concerns? And it's really tied to how water moves through a watershed and how the patterns of our wildfires have changed. So in an unburned watershed, most of the water in the water cycle of the watershed isn't what you see in a river or a creek. Most of the water either slowly sinks into the ground, or as Russ alluded to earlier, it evapotranspirates first through the plants and then into the atmosphere. It's that organic layer at the forest floor created by our forests that creates like a watershed sponge, basically, and allows water to slowly infiltrate into the ground. So when we have these really big, large footprint, high intensity, really hot fires, the difference is that spongy layer gets burnt up and there's no more vegetation, or very much less vegetation, to pull water into the atmosphere. And so the net result of that in these high severity burn areas is that you have way more volume of water moving over the surface of the slopes and the forest. And that excess volume of water moves at a higher velocity, has more energy in it. And as it's moving, more of that water is moving over the slopes, it's going to pull all of that ash, sediment, debris, fallen trees, rocks down the slopes and drives it into receiving waters and whatever is in its path. So what you see here in this video is a video that was taken after the High Park fire. So in 2012, the High Park fire happened. At the time, it was the largest wildfire in Larimer County's history. And this type of event where we got black water coming down the drainage happened pretty much anytime we had a large rain event, or even a moderate sized rain event in the watershed over the burn area. We'd get these types of events. We'd see this black water. It would interrupt or damage and destroy important transportation corridors, and all of that material eventually made its way into the Poudre itself. So these are some of the, it's just one example of what our concerns are moving forward. These types of impacts, the degree and extent of these types of impacts after a large wildfire, can vary greatly and really depend on a lot of different factors. And I'm happy to answer questions about what those factors are. We don't know yet what all of the impacts or the degree and extent of the impacts will be from the Cameron Peak fire. We're waiting for that first set of rainstorm events to happen to see what that will look like. But we've been working very closely with many people to try and understand and predict what those impacts will be. So why does this matter? A watershed like the Cache-la-Poudre watershed, which is pretty similar to many of the watersheds headwaters across Colorado and throughout the West. Our forested headwaters support a wide array of really critical watershed values. So even if you live like hundreds of miles downstream from these burn events, it touches your day-to-day life. The Cache-la-Poudre watershed supports drinking water for over 300,000 people. It supports irrigation water for at least 200,000 irrigated acres directly or fully, or in part, or partially or fully. This watershed also supplies the industrial water for a really important chip manufacturing industry locally, and a really important brewing industry, in addition to a multi-million-dollar recreational industry. The Arapaho Roosevelt that Monty manages is the third or fourth most visited national forest in the country. We have a really important whitewater industry and a really important recreational fishing industry. The Cache-la-Poudre is also the only wild and scenic river designated in the state of Colorado. So there's a lot of values that are at risk and put at risk from these types of events. And these types of post-fire impacts, we know from other wildfires in Colorado and across the West, can last anywhere from 3 years to more than 10 years. So it's not a small change in our landscape. And when you combine the footprint of the High Park fire with the footprint of the Cameron Peak fire, that's a huge amount of our landscape and our watershed that has radically changed in the past 10 years. Given that degree of the sheer size of the Cameron Peak footprint, the number of the different land ownership, the different cross-jurisdictional issues, the number of different government agencies that have different jurisdictions in or downstream from that footprint, dealing with the recovery from this type of event takes a lot of collaboration. It takes a lot of work to bring all of those different agencies together and really think through strategically, thoughtfully, prioritizing all of the needs. Over 200,000 acres, we can't treat every single piece of burn acreage in the burn footprint. We have to make choices. And so we work really carefully together to use the best available science to plan and prioritize those needs. And one last thing that I want to leave with you, just that's specific or maybe a little bit unique about the Cameron Peak fire and some of the other fires that happened in 2020. I've already mentioned the importance of this watershed for our drinking water supply, but the Cameron Peak fire, with the extent of its spatial footprint and where it fell on that landscape, not only did it burn around the Poudre and the Big Thompson watershed itself, so the rivers that supply directly raw water for drinking water for about 50% of the needs of both Greeley and Fort Collins, but it also encompassed at least five of the most important water storage reservoirs in our watershed. So the ripple-on compounding effects of this type of event on our water supply is particularly concerning for our local municipal water suppliers. When you couple that the redundancy in our water supply comes from the Big Thompson, Colorado Big Thompson, that was affected by the East Troublesome fire in 2020 as well. We're in a situation where there's a lot of concern about what this means for how well our watersheds can continue to support water supply without risk moving forward. So there's a lot of work going into trying to mitigate those impacts. And I think I'll just leave it there and open the floor for any questions about that.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Monty. Thank you, Russ. Wow, we have both complementary and diverse perspectives. And Jen, I definitely think we're going to get back into some of this recovery, right? Where are we right now from 2020? But I bet there's a lot of thoughts on people's minds about this upcoming fire season. So let me start with Russ with this question, because let's just get it out of the way. What are we looking like for the upcoming fire season? That one graph you showed has that pretty deep extended red territory, right, of both drought and temperature, and that pretty deep and like down in there kind of, we're not coming out of this anytime soon. So what are we looking like with our current snowpack, our current soil moisture? What does the upcoming season look like from your perspective and beyond, but definitely this upcoming year, this upcoming fire season?
Yeah, so I think for the fire situation specifically, it's probably still a little bit too early to say for sure. There's a lot of things that can happen between now and the summer. But that being said, we're in most places, we're not going into it in great shape. Right. The soils were very dry after last summer. The snowpack has gotten back up to closer to average in most places in Colorado from some storms here in February and March, but the drought certainly persists, and the outlooks for the spring and summer don't look great. It looks odds tilted towards warm and dry. So here along the northern Front Range, we had this massive snowstorm a couple weeks ago, and there was a lot of moisture there, and that has helped a lot kind of in our specific area, where we are here in the Denver, Fort Collins, and the mountains west of us. But if you go further west, they didn't get nearly as much snow from those, and last summer was even more extreme in those areas. And so if we look at the US Drought Monitor map right now, it still looks very bad once you get kind of west of the immediate Front Range here. So I might leave the kind of specific fire aspects to Monty, but it's not it certainly is not exactly where we want to be going into a summer. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that could happen between now and June that could mitigate that. But that's not what the outlooks are pointing to at this point.
Monty, did you want to add on to that? Like what's your view of this upcoming season?
Sure. One of the things that was fascinating about last year and terrifying all at the same time was we still had active fire Thanksgiving week. And if the fire teams had not been able to put that out at that point, that may have drawn clear into January. And I'm not sure we'd have ever seen anything like that. What was happening was the big heavy fuels. So stuff that's the logs, that are standing or laying down on the ground. they came into the when the fire started drier than the timber that you buy at Home Depot. It was that dry. And it takes a long time for moisture to be in contact with that wood for it to get wet again and not want to burn as well. And when it dries out, we have a measurement. It's called energy release component, ERC. And when it gets up above around the 97th percentile in their way of calculating it, then you got all sorts of crazy behavior. Well, we kept having those high numbers all through the year, and even in different times. As you know, Labor Day, we had a ton of snow. It melted. That didn't do anything for those big logs. Many of our big runs, as you saw in my slideshow, came after that point. And so really this is a game of how long do we get moisture that will slowly soak into those logs and make them wetter and wetter and get them where they don't burn with the explosive energy that they did that year. So I don't know where our heavies are at right now, but what I've been hearing, they haven't recovered as much as we would like to. And then another thing that happened last year is where did the monsoons go? And so normally we start to warm up and we start to dry out and all that happens, but then we get a period where, you know, there's clouds and there's rainstorms and all of that. And it's not as hot, it's not as dry, and maybe even adding moisture to the system. And so we get a break in the middle of the summer, and then it really takes a while for the fires to take off steam. And not last year, it just built and built and built until August. So it really, in my mind, is two things. I'm listening to Russ very carefully because he's foresaging what the summer looks like, but it's going to depend upon, do we keep getting moisture or does it dry out and we lose what we've gotten with the recent storms? But also, are those monsoons coming? And what are they going to do when they're here? And they'll make all the difference in the world in terms of what our fire outlook looks like later in the summer.
Thank you, Monty. So you made the point earlier, and both you and Russ have made the point that the wildfires that we experienced are a combination of weather and fuels, right? And I want to ask you a bit about the 20th century forest management that you referred to in your slideshow. But before I get there, I noticed something else about that green line that you showed, and you described it as the place where we can realistically and strategically build barriers to fire that's moving from the west. And last week, we also heard from Camille Stephen Ruman about the different types of forests. And it looks to me like that line kind of straddles the transition between the higher elevation forests and the lower elevation forests. Can you speak to that a little bit and the meaningfulness of that? Oh, yeah.
Oh, we clicked the wrong one. You know, it's one of those that as you start to unpack it, you think you got a croissant layer and you're going to tease that out, and then you realize there's a whole bunch of more croissant layers in that one layer, and that you hit upon a number of things. So first and foremost, I would say this: that line is a line that is the combination of a lot of folks putting their brains around and saying, where could, you know, they're thinking like, okay, what if it was a 2020 and this fire was roaring? Where would we have the best place to make a stand? And where do we invest first? Because like I say, there's a lot of work that needs to go in that watershed. That later next steps may have been, and although we're evaluating now where we're going to go in the future, maybe going more up the center of the canyon as well, and making kind of a cross just instead of a stripe to break down even more of the landscape into a smaller area. Each of those types of strategies are really specific to the site that you're in, and you nailed it. It takes in, what are your values at risk? What are you trying to protect? Where do you have a chance to do something? Where do you think you've got the ability actually to get in there and treat? If you've got a whole bunch of homeowners that are just saying there's no way in heck and I'm never going to do anything here, and you need to treat on their property to be able to make it work, well, maybe we step back to a different location. You're absolutely right in terms of where it was picked in terms of the forest type. It's the montane forest with ponderosa pine. And one of the things that, if you look at how ponderosa pine interacts with fire, which is different than the west of there, which is a lodgepole pine, is it loves fire, and fire's in there every so many years. And it's a place, actually, once you build something like that stripe, you can maintain it in that state. And so now it's kind of a permanent edifice with a minimal amount of effort in terms of just continuing to burn it and keep it in a lower density state. The lodgepole pine just to the west of there, it doesn't burn that way. It burns more catastrophically. It goes up all at once. And so it's a harder place to try to create something that creates a barrier for fire. So good question and good points in terms of why that place was picked.
And John, if I could just add to that, when Monty referenced the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative during his actual talk, that's really that collaborative effort to do that strategic planning and really bring in those cross-jurisdictional elements to think strategically about how we get those treatments on the ground, how do we use the best available science to make those picks, but then how do we work with our agencies and our communities to think beyond the defensible space bubble? Like, how do we bring communities into that process of planning and getting more community buy-in for this type of work, so that we really are planning where the work needs to happen and not just where we have permission from the federal government to work. And that process takes a long time to bring those communities along that gravy train of decision-making. So we're typically like a couple years out between when we start planning these cross-jurisdictional larger treatment areas in that ribbon area to when we actually implement. And it's kind of why we didn't get to that when Monty referenced that one treatment area that we were working on. Forest Service had big project area on the federal side, and a bunch of the partners, CPRW, Forest Stewards Guild, we had a bunch of work lined up adjacent on the private land side, but we were so close, but we didn't get there to implementation before this fire happened.
I think we need like 3 hours tonight.
Yeah, clearly.
And I know John and I want to talk a little bit about kind of, past management and what are we doing nowadays that's different and what can we be doing better. So some of that strategic thinking that you both are talking about here. But I want to actually start and pivot us into this just a little bit, which is the WUI, the wildland-urban interface that John mentioned. I think it's what I read earlier. There's about 46 million residences, according to FEMA, and this is across the U.S., not Colorado, right, that are located in the WUI, the interface between our urban where we live, not Denver urban, where houses are, and the wildland interface. This number continues to grow, right? People, where are we seeing growth? We are seeing growth, in these areas, definitely in Colorado, as well as other parts of the West. This is a really important component to how we think about managing wildfires currently, jurisdiction that you were talking about, Jen, and how do we do some prevention. So I want to ask all three of you, but maybe I'll start with Monty a little bit here, which is, should people be rebuilding and building in these areas, knowing that wildfires are a natural part of our environment, right? And you have your work cut out for you for doing some of this management. But what should we be thinking about as a society and as individuals? And I understand people lost homes, and this is really personal for people. So this is a hard question. So feel free to take that as you will. And Jen, I want you to chime in after Monty, because you have a new way of talking about the WUI that I want you to share too. But let's start with Monty on this.
I think there's a couple of interesting things. The WUI was a concept and an idea that came out, 15 years ago or so. And this idea that maybe, as we look across the landscape and what do we do about this? Where do we prioritize our efforts? And then do we do something different in there? So I'll make two arguments. First one is that I think our concept of WUI has changed. And I'll explain that in a second. And so I'm not sure in ways that we've traditionally used WUI, whether it's as effective a way of talking about fire treatments. But the second part is then tied to the first, in this idea that WUI is something special, at least if you think about the places in and around homes. And you can't forget about that place in lieu of the other thing I'm going to talk about. And so the thing I wanted to mention is Cameron Peak, 17 miles one day. How far away from a house do you need to be to say that the fire's right next to the house? Is one day's worth of burning close enough? East Troublesome burnt over the top of the Continental Divide and made a run at Estes Park, all in one burn period. How far away do you need to be from a home to say now you're in the WUI? So if you look at the kind of more traditional definition of WUI and say, well, it's that place that's kind of close. Boy, I'm not sure how far you got to be away to not be close to homes now. So, but with that, I think you have to think about, so separating that from a definition standpoint and thinking about houses and such that way. But you thinking about the area around homes. I believe that if you're going to make a choice, I'm not going to advise anybody to not to or to live out in the woods. I certainly, that's the place I want to be all the time myself. But what I'm going to say is that it's not as simple, I don't think, anymore, of just going around your house and looking and saying, what do I do here? I think as you look at where homes burned, the ability to have type 1, our best firefighters be able to shelter in place and stay in those sites as the fire boils over, often made some of the biggest differences to whether homes were standing or not. There's a lot of discussion. This gets really into a complex discussion, but what it means, I think, in the end, if I just were to get it into a single point, is that as a neighborhood, you need to look at what you got going on. And you need to do some work to make sure not only you've reduced the risk if a big fire, just as we might look at it at the landscape level, but also, do you have the ability, is it safe enough actually to hold fire crews in there as that fire is burning over? And that's going to take a lot of work in terms of talking with your local fire departments and building strategies that are legit. So on that bad day, people can hang and maybe protect your house. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and Kristen, just to add to that, so two things at the most immediate. I think of it almost, and we generally in our group talk about, there's like the planning Russian doll, right? And the smallest, more central part of that is where communities or homeowners have the most agency, and that's immediately around their house or immediately in their communities. There's a lot of both responsibility and agency for people to do work to protect themselves from fire in that space. And that's traditionally where we've really focused this WUI conversation, is in that space. But Monty's right, like the current trends in our wildfires, that's not enough to provide protection to that space. So that's why, we're working at that next sort of, the neighborhood to the sub-watershed to the full landscape kind of layer, so that we can bring more of those layers of protection to all sorts of watershed values, including communities. Community wildfire protection plans historically have focused in that innermost space. And what we're trying to do with the fireshed planning is reach across those lines and really trying to pull and link those types of planning together, so that as local volunteer fire departments and their individual homeowners are focusing on those near space stuff, we're building out from that with our planning and integrating across that. I think one of the conversations that has been changing in the wildfire and forest and fire community is just this notion of WUI in the first place. The focus historically has been on the structures, the residential structures that are in the forest, that are close to where we would expect fires to happen. But as I alluded to earlier, we have so many assets and infrastructure just interwoven throughout all of our watersheds. So how do you really separate WUI from, the water supply infrastructure, or for the recreational infrastructure or our transportation infrastructure? And if you really look at the WUI from the perspective of what's at risk from these wildfires, the definition of WUI can change radically. So there's an ongoing conversation that has been shaping up in our community for a little while now about whether we need to rethink the WUI, not just from a you shouldn't have wood shingles on your roof kind of perspective, but what does it really mean for us to be so dependent on these headwater areas, and how do we really plan and adapt to those risks?
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. So just a little plug for next week. One of our speakers next week has been working with the Jemez Pueblo down in New Mexico, and is going to speak to 500 years of living with fire in the WUI. So I think that's going to be a super fascinating perspective. What you and Monty and Jen, what you're saying is, one of our audience members commented that, this fire jumped the continental divide. If that can't serve as a fire break, what does? And what you're telling us is that it's a lot more complicated than that, and we have to be a lot more sophisticated than that to think that we're simply going to build fire breaks to work our way out of this. If I may,
one thing.
Oh, go ahead, Monty.
I just was going to say, I do think if you look at what happened with Cameron Peak, the technical solutions that group of people worked so hard to make worked. And it was scientifically sound, it was well thought out. And even though it wasn't complete, it was enough that fire was stopped twice. And the place that it blew through, coming out into the Glen Haven area, we just weren't that far along. And so the thing that, I would throw out there is that if we're able at a landscape scale to take a Cameron Peak and cut it off at 100,000 acres after kind of that last run into Red Feather, but that third run didn't happen, there was 200 and something homes down in that piece. And so when we start talking about protecting houses, you got to think conversation wise about where do you put emphasis? My argument is you got to do both. You got to do both, but you can't do one in exclusion of the other. And I think that's an important thing for folks to recognize. It's not just, if I treat around my house, I'm going to be protected. And we saw that, especially with many of the fires that happened on the West Coast this year, in some of those homes or those cities like Paradise and such, where fire came down and blew through there. You got to think about both.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Monty. We also know, as Russ started us off, that climate continues to be an important factor in all of this. Russ, you may have noticed that one of our audience members shared an old adage that a forest takes 7 years to recover from drought, to Monty's point about being fully rehydrated or not. I don't know what sciences there is behind that, but I do know that, when I was sitting at a Rockies baseball game back in 2002, ash was falling on me from the Hayman fire way back then in 2002. And then in 2012, we had the High Peak fire. We had some more fires in 2013, more fires in 2018 and 2020. There does seem to be something cyclical possibly going on here, just anecdotally. I don't know whether that's related to recovery from drought in the forest or not, but can you share with us a little bit of your perspective on the cyclical nature of things, and is that continuing to build over time, and where do you think we might be headed?
Well, so right. I mean, there's plenty of history of drought in Colorado and throughout the West. Our climate is prone to that, and to having periods of, in some cases, multiple years in a row of dryness. And certainly within the last 20 years, there's been a pretty strong connection between the drought years and the big fire years. All those years you mentioned, 2002, 2012, 2018, 2020, were all pretty significant droughts. So that connection is certainly there. Going forward into the future, the research that's been done on this all really points to increased acreage of burning, more intense fires in the West as the climate continues to warm, basically for these same reasons that we've been talking about, just kind of those, it's not going to be every year necessarily, but the number of years where you have these hot, dry conditions in the summer will be more frequent, primarily because the hotter it is, the drier it is, essentially. So that's kind of what what most of it's been pointing to. And I think we all got to witness that firsthand in I think maybe even fire has not been my sort of area of research necessarily, but I think just kind of having looked at what we've seen over time here in Colorado, this year opened a lot of eyes as to what was even possible, and we know that, it may not be next year or 5 years from now, but that we're going to have even hotter summers than we had last year as we continue to go forward. And we know that dry summers happen here from time to time. So at some point there will be conditions that are even more favorable than what we saw last summer, or favorable for the fires, unfavorable for all of us.
Thank you, for Russ. As audience members are quickly understanding, we are approaching time. So John and I have a million questions, but I want to try to pull in a couple threads from some audience kind of questions and remarks we have here. And think about the idea of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Or something along the lines. I probably misspoke on that. But we have, questions in here resolving around commercial logging, around prescribed burns, right? Very much preventative measures, and there's many more here. And I would say, what does it mean to invest money in prevention? Not necessarily suppression, because we can go down that route too, right? But prevention. Where should we be investing resources? What are we thinking about when it comes to prevention? Some of these things, and historically, logging is seen as really bad in certain eyes and turned away. Same thing with prescribed burns. Monty, I see you nodding. What are your thoughts on the role of prevention here versus when we have to get to the point of investing in recovery, right? How do we prevent?
You bet. You think about the money that we've spent from a suppression standpoint just on that one fire, and now the damages, which are almost as much as we've spent on it. It's unbelievable how much money that is, hundreds of millions of dollars. And yet the work and the investment of the amount of money that we've spent to create what we did was just a fraction, just a small fraction of that. And so I think there's a lot packed into that question, which I'm sure that's the way you did it. But one of the things is that when I have worked with environmental groups about wondering about why we're doing something, one of the things about what I think is happening on the Arapaho Roosevelt right now is by having strategic vision, there's a direct connection between why this thing's happening on the ground and what it creates. So it's easier to see the pros and the cons of that decision. The second thing is it's not being done in a back room, and then you end up with a letter saying, oh, by the way, next month we're going to cut and burn all of your world. The conversation is starting, in the community with Jen and our fireshed partners around what does this look like. And when the local VFD captain comes and participates, when he goes back to his community and he talks to Bob and Joe, his neighbors, about the whys and the whats, it makes a difference in terms of they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I think the strategic vision piece is really critical, because you've got to be able to lay it out in ways that people see what's happening and why. And then the social license piece has always been this idea of working with publics and working with people and creating a vision that people can live with in their community, that also has to be scientifically credible and reasonable and do some good. We haven't done that as well as we needed to. And people like Jen and others, we have other watershed coalitions on the Arapaho Roosevelt that are doing the same thing on Boulder and in Gilpin and other places. They're doing that, and they're making this possible for us to have those conversations and involve the public with it. So I'll stop there.
Kristen, I know we're running out of time, but I just posted something in the chat. The Fireshed itself is doing a series of webinars over the next couple of months to dig into like the why we're doing it, how we put prescribed fires together, all of the nuts and bolts that we don't have time to get into here. So people can tune into those over the coming months if they want to learn more about some of that.
Thank you.
Jen, I'm going to ask one more question that I think is to you before Kristen takes us out. But I think last week you said something to Kristen and me that I've still been thinking about, and I wonder if you can just say one or two comments about this. And this that your point was that we all need to own the risk associated with forest management and wildfire. Can you say just a word or two about that?
Well, I mean, I think it gets back to that, what I was talking about earlier about where we each have agency and space to act. But we all receive impacts from that risk. And so there's a really important conversation to have about what kind of outcomes would we prefer to manage or deal with? And this is sort of what Kristen was alluding to, is it are we worried about the risk of a prescribed fire? Or are we worried about the risk from a Cameron Peak fire or an East Troublesome like event? What are you more willing to have in your neighborhood? With prescribed fires, there is so much work that goes into planning and mitigating and contingency plans around those types of events to really reduce that risk. There's still a lot of fear from communities around that, but really the risk, it's never eliminated, but it's much less than what we have when we have years like 2020. And so I think there's a really important conversation, and 2020 is maybe going to be the springboard for us to have a more fulsome conversation with our communities about what are the outcomes that we want to see on our landscape and in our communities and downstream of these forested areas. And what do we want to do to share in that process, whether it's risk or the implementation part of it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I would have loved to talk about risk with you all and behavior and living on uncertainty even. I know Russ, as the researcher, probably has some advice on that too, and all of you through your perspectives. Thank you for sharing the link for additional resources. Thank you all to our audience for joining us tonight. A huge thank you, of course, to our guests, Jen, Russ, Monty. It was a great pleasure getting to talk with you in the weeks leading up to this and tonight. We covered a lot of ground and we could have stayed on forever. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It was a really nice way to spend a Monday evening. As a reminder, we have 2 more episodes coming up. Same time, same place for the next 2 Mondays in a row. Mondays at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. Next week, we're going to be talking about, quote unquote, the human element. It is a pretty big piece of that, but we're really going to talk about the wildland-urban interface a little bit more. We have the mayor for Estes Park joining us. We have an author who embedded herself with firefighters, so talking about those who are literally on the front lines trying to fight these fires when they do come about. And as John mentioned, a researcher who works with the Jemez Pueblo. So a diverse setup and lineup for next Monday next week. So we hopefully see you all there. Nicole dropped in a ton of resources and links for you all. We will send up a follow-up email as well with a link to the recording and maybe some additional reading resources based on what our speakers have been talking about and some of the work that we do. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And huge thank you to John and the Center for Collaborative Conservation. It's such a pleasure to partner with them and all of our other partners. And of course, thank you to Gates Family Foundation for helping us sponsor this webinar series. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.